The little black girl warned the biker someone pulled a child into a locked room beneath the underground mall. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. It was a regular afternoon at the underground mall. People were buzzing in and out of the stores, the typical hum of chatter filling the air. But then, out of nowhere, a small figure dashed through the crowd. A little black girl, no older than 7 or 8, her face streaked with tears, ran straight toward a group of bikers gathered by a food stall. They were part of the Thunderwolves Motorcycle Club, a group of tough, grizzled bikers who had recently been trying to make a name for themselves in the community by participating in charity events and helping the less fortunate. But today, none of that mattered. This little girl, with her braids flying behind her and her clothes torn at the seams, was clearly in distress. She ran up to the group, nearly tripping over her own feet as she gasped for breath. "Please help me," she cried, grabbing one of the bikers by the jacket. Her small voice trembled with fear. Someone pulled my brother into a locked room. Under the mall. The bikers froze, exchanging looks of confusion. They weren't used to hearing such things in a public place like this. "What do you mean?" One of them, Forge, the leader of the group, asked, his voice firm but concerned. The girl, trembling from head to toe, pointed a shaky finger toward a nondescript hallway at the far end of the mall. "There. In that room. They took him," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the busy crowd. Her eyes were wide, filled with both fear and desperation. "Please, you have to help. He's my brother, and I don't know what they're doing to him." Forge's heart sank. He had seen his fair share of violence and danger, but something about the fear in the girl's eyes made him uneasy. He turned to his crew. "All right, let's move," he ordered. "Stay close, stay quiet. We don't know what we're walking into." The bikers nodded, their faces hardening. Despite their tough exteriors, the bond of family within the club ran deep. They didn't leave anyone behind. As they followed the girl down the narrow hallway, Forge's mind raced. Who would do something like this? And why? The girl had mentioned a locked room. What was behind that door? It didn't matter now. They had to get to her brother, and they had to do it fast. The hallway stretched on, dimly lit, with only the sound of their boots echoing against the cold tiles. The girl led them to a door at the end of the hall. It was heavy, metal, and had no windows. "This is it," she said, her voice cracking. Forge stepped forward, testing the door handle. It was locked, just as the girl had said. The bikers gathered around, each one ready for whatever came next. But what they didn't expect was what happened next. Just as Forge was about to kick down the door, they heard a voice from the other side. A deep, gruff voice. "You're too late." The words sent a chill down their spines. The door wasn't just locked, it was being guarded. And whoever was behind it wasn't afraid to make their presence known. I have to admit, nothing could have prepared them for what came next. The moment Forge heard the voice from the other side of the door, his blood ran cold. "You're too late." The words echoed in the narrow hallway like a warning shot, but they weren't about to back down. Forge's grip tightened on the door handle as the rest of the bikers stepped up behind him, their faces hard with determination. They had promised this little girl they would help her brother, and nothing, not even a locked door or the voice of some unknown man, was going to stop them. Forge signaled to the group. "On 3, we make our move." As his words hung in the air, the tension in the hallway was palpable. The girl, her face still streaked with tears, was staring at the door, her body trembling. Forge could see how much she was relying on them, and that weight only added to the urgency in his chest. 1, 2, 3. With a roar, Forge kicked the door with all the strength he could muster. The metal door splintered as the force of the kick sent it crashing inward, revealing a small, dimly lit room. The room smelled musty, the air stale, but what caught their attention immediately was the figure standing in the center. A man, tall and built like a tank, wearing a black leather jacket and a cold expression that seemed to pierce right through them. He didn't flinch as they entered, only stepped aside slightly, making room for them to see what was behind him. And there, on the floor, was a young boy, no older than 10, tied to a chair, his eyes wide with terror. The boy's clothes were torn, his face dirty, but it was the fear in his eyes that shook Forge to his core. "Get away from him!" the girl shouted, rushing forward, but Forge caught her by the arm, pulling her back. "Stay behind us," he said, his voice low but firm. The man in the leather jacket raised an eyebrow. "You think you can stop me? I'm just following orders." Forge didn't waste any more words. "You're making a big mistake, buddy," he growled, taking a step forward. But before he could move any closer, the man pulled out a knife, its blade gleaming in the low light. "I'm not the one making mistakes," the man hissed, his grip tightening around the handle. Forge's heart pounded in his chest. He had faced down danger before, but this situation was different. They weren't just fighting for themselves, they were fighting for a child, a life. The bikers knew what they had to do. "Get ready," Forge muttered under his breath as he motioned for the others to fan out. Diesel, the biggest and toughest member of the club, moved in first, his massive frame pushing through the small space like a wrecking ball. He was quick, but not reckless. He reached the man just as he lunged with the knife. With a swift movement, Diesel knocked the knife from the man's hand, sending it skittering across the floor. The man staggered back, but Diesel wasn't finished. In one fluid motion, he grabbed the man by the throat and slammed him against the wall, pinning him there with a force that rattled the room. "Who the hell are you?" Diesel snarled, his face inches from the man's. The man didn't answer, his eyes wild with panic. "You're not going anywhere," Forge said, stepping forward. His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the threat behind it. "Now let the kid go." The man swallowed hard, his chest heaving as he struggled to break free from Diesel's grip. I don't have a choice," he stammered. "I'm just doing what I'm told." But Forge wasn't buying it. He nodded to Wrench, who was already cutting the boy free from the chair with a pair of scissors. The boy's arms were trembling, but when he saw the bikers, a glimmer of hope appeared in his eyes. "Thank you," the boy whispered, his voice barely audible. "You're safe now," Wrench reassured him, gently lifting him into his arms. "You're going to be okay." With the boy now free, the bikers turned their attention back to the man who had caused all of this. Forge stepped closer, his gaze cold. "Who gave you the orders?" he asked again, his voice low but filled with authority. The man didn't respond at first, but after a long, tense silence, he finally spoke. "The serpents. They told me to keep him here. Said he was a liability." The bikers exchanged uneasy glances. The serpents were a notorious gang known for their illegal activities, and if they were involved in this, things were about to get a lot more complicated. "You're going to tell us everything," Forge said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And if you don't, you're going to regret it." As the man looked around at the group of bikers, all of whom were silently watching him, he realized that he had nowhere to run. The bikers had taken control of the situation, and there was no escaping their reach. Iron Riders stood silent, the air thick with tension as the man, the one who had taken the boy, was pinned against the wall. His breath came in ragged gasps, his eyes darting between the bikers, hoping for an escape, but there was nowhere to go. The small room felt colder now, the sound of the boy's sobs still fresh in their ears. Forge stepped forward, his eyes narrowed, every muscle in his body coiled with the promise of action. "You've got one shot to tell us everything," he said, his voice cold and steady, carrying the weight of someone who had seen too much to let this slide. The man flinched, his throat tight under Diesel's grip. He looked around the room, his eyes flicking from Forge to the bikers standing behind him, the fury and determination clear on their faces. The realization hit him hard. This wasn't just a gang. This wasn't a bunch of outlaws out for a ride. These were men who protected their own, and right now, this little boy, this innocent victim, was their own. The man's eyes hardened, but the fear didn't leave them. I didn't want to do this," he muttered, barely loud enough to be heard. "But they promised me money. The serpents, they said they would take care of me." Forge's jaw clenched at the mention of the serpents. The biker gang was notorious for their brutal tactics and illegal operations. They were not to be trifled with, and the fact that they were now targeting children was a new low, even for them. "The serpents," Forge repeated slowly, his eyes narrowing. "What are they planning with the boy?" The man swallowed hard. "He's not just a random kid. He's important," he said, his voice trembling. "They've been watching him for a while. His father used to be with the serpents. He was a good soldier, but he left them. The serpents wanted him to come back. They think his son might be the key to something. Forge exchanged a look with Diesel. This wasn't just about a random kidnapping anymore. It was bigger than that. What do you mean, the key? Forge pressed, his voice hard. The man shook his head. I don't know. I swear to God, I don't know. They just told me to bring him here, to hold him until they got what they needed. He hesitated, then added. They said they would make it worth my while. I thought I could get out of this, but now, his voice trailed off. Forge didn't want to hear the rest of it. He didn't need to. He turned to his crew. We need to find out where the serpents are hiding. Now, if they're after this kid, they're going to come for him again. The bikers nodded. They had already made up their minds. They weren't going to let this kid slip through their fingers. Not after everything they had seen. Diesel released the man, but not before slamming him against the wall one last time. You'd better hope we don't find out you're lying, Diesel growled. The man nodded frantically, his eyes wide with terror. Forge turned to the little boy, who was now sitting on the floor, his legs pulled close to his chest, his tear-streaked face a picture of fear and confusion. He had been through enough for one night, but he wasn't alone anymore. The bikers had made sure of that. You're safe now, Forge said gently, kneeling down beside him. The boy looked up at him, his big brown eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, he whispered. Forge smiled softly, a rare moment of warmth breaking through his usually stern demeanor. You don't have to thank us. We're family. The boy nodded, his small hands clutching the hem of his shirt, trying to make sense of everything. The girl, who had been standing in the background, watching anxiously, stepped forward. She looked at Forge, her eyes filled with determination. You're going to stop them, right? You're going to make sure they don't hurt anyone else. Forge stood up, his gaze hardening. We're going to stop them, and we're going to make sure they can't hurt anyone else. With that, the bikers got to work. They quickly gathered their things, checking their bikes, ensuring they were ready for what was about to come. This wasn't just a rescue mission anymore. It was war. The serpents had made their move, and the Thunderwolves were not about to back down. Let's move, Forge ordered. The bikers revved their engines, the sound of the motorcycles roaring to life, signaling the beginning of what would be an all-out battle. They weren't just protecting a child now. They were protecting everyone the serpents would ever target. And the Thunderwolves were ready to show them what it meant to mess with the wrong people. Iron Riders were on the move, and there was no turning back. The bikes thundered down the highway, cutting through the night like a storm of leather and chrome. Forge led the pack, his eyes focused on the road ahead, but his mind was racing. The serpents weren't just a gang. They were a force to be reckoned with, and the fact that they had set their sights on a child was something Forge couldn't ignore. They had to be stopped, no matter the cost. The adrenaline was pumping through his veins as the wind howled past him, the familiar roar of the engine beneath him comforting in its intensity. Every mile that passed felt like another step closer to something bigger than just a rescue mission. It felt like war. Diesel, the club's enforcer, was right behind him, his massive frame taking the curves of the road like a beast. He wasn't speaking, but Forge knew what was on his mind. They were all thinking the same thing. The serpents were dangerous, and they had to be wiped out. The boy and his sister were only the beginning. This wasn't going to end until the serpents were gone for good. The rest of the crew followed in perfect formation, their bikes lined up, engines roaring in unison. They were a family, bound not by blood, but by loyalty, and nothing, not even the threat of death, was going to break that bond. The night stretched on, the miles ticking by until they finally reached the outskirts of the city. They pulled into a small town on the edge of nowhere, the lights dim and the streets eerily quiet. This was where they would make their stand. They didn't know exactly where the serpents were hiding, but Forge had a plan. The girl, Aisha, had given them a name. The leader of the serpents, a man named Viper. If they could find him, they could bring down the entire operation. And they would do it the right way. No mercy, no hesitation. The crew parked their bikes in a quiet alley, keeping their engines running for quick escape if necessary. Forge surveyed the area, looking for any signs of the serpent's presence. This town had the feeling of a place where things were hidden in the dark, and they were going to uncover whatever secrets it had. We need to find Viper, Forge said, his voice low but firm. Diesel nodded, cracking his knuckles. We'll find him, he said. And when we do, we'll make sure he never hurts anyone again. Wrench, the club's mechanic, and Phantom, a former teacher, moved off to the side, whispering to each other as they scanned the area. It was clear that they were ready for whatever came next. But Forge couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. "We've got to be careful," Forge said, his gaze hardening. "The serpents are good at hiding, and they don't play by the rules. But we've got something they don't." He paused, looking at his crew. "We've got each other." The crew nodded, their expressions grim but resolute. They had been through hell together, and this was no different. They had made promises to those who couldn't protect themselves, and they would keep those promises, no matter what it took. The plan was simple: find Viper, take him down, and free anyone else the serpents had hurt along the way. But even as Forge set his plan into motion, something in the back of his mind nagged at him. It was too quiet. The kind of silence that only came when something was waiting to happen. He glanced over at Diesel, who gave him a knowing look. They weren't the only ones on the move. The serpents had to be aware of their presence by now. The clock was ticking, and they needed to make their move fast. "Let's split up," Forge said, his voice cutting through the tension. "Wrench and Phantom, check the back streets. Diesel, you're with me. We'll head toward the old warehouse. Stay in contact. If anything goes wrong, we move in fast." The group split off into their assigned teams, each biker knowing exactly what needed to be done. As Forge and Diesel made their way toward the warehouse, the streets seemed to narrow, the shadows growing longer. It wasn't long before they reached the location, a rundown building tucked away on the edge of town. Forge's instincts screamed that this was it. They weren't far behind Viper. They just had to find a way in. But before they could make a move, a figure stepped out of the shadows. A man, tall and imposing, wearing the colors of the serpents. Forge's heart skipped a beat as the man locked eyes with him. "I was wondering when you'd show up," the man said, his voice low and dangerous. "Viper's waiting for you, but I don't think you'll make it to him." Forge didn't hesitate. He had come this far, and he wasn't about to back down now. "We're not here for a chat," he said, his voice a growl. "We're here to end this. Now move." The man sneered, but didn't move. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a gun. "Then let's see if you're ready for what's coming next," he said, aiming the weapon at Forge. Diesel stepped forward, blocking Forge from the line of fire. "You should have stayed out of our way," Diesel growled. The biker smirked, but Forge could see the uncertainty in his eyes. He wasn't going to get away with this. Not today. The air was thick with tension as the man aimed a gun at Forge. The seconds felt like hours, the sound of Diesel's heavy breathing behind him the only thing that grounded Forge in the moment. He could see the uncertainty in the man's eyes, the shaky grip on the weapon as he tried to assert control over the situation. But Forge had faced down bigger threats than this. He wasn't backing down now. "You really think you can stop us?" Forge's voice was calm, almost dismissive. His eyes never left the barrel of the gun. The man didn't respond. His finger twitched on the trigger, but before he could pull it, Diesel lunged forward, knocking the gun out of his hand with a swift, powerful strike. The man stumbled back, eyes wide in shock, but Diesel didn't give him a chance to recover. In one fluid motion, Diesel grabbed him by the throat, lifting him off the ground. "You don't get to make the rules here," Diesel growled, his grip tightening. The man gasped for air, his feet kicking helplessly beneath him. "Where's Viper?" Forge demanded. "Tell me where he is, or this is going to get a lot worse for you." The man's eyes shifted to the side, panic flashing across his face. He knew he had no chance. "The warehouse, on the other side of town," he rasped. "Viper's there, but you're too late. He's already got what he wants." Diesel squeezed harder, his voice low and dangerous. "Don't test me, punk." Okay, the man gasped. "He's got a shipment coming in tonight. That's what he's been waiting for. Guns, cash, all of it." Forge's mind raced. This wasn't just about a kidnapped child anymore. The serpents were dealing in something much bigger, and they were prepared to protect it with everything they had. "Tell me more," Forge said, his voice cold. The man nodded weakly, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "There's a secret entrance in the back of the warehouse. Viper's men are all around the place. They'll shoot on sight if they see you coming." Diesel tightened his grip again, lifting the man higher. "And what else?" "There's a guy inside. He's been working for Viper for years," the man said, his voice shaking. "He'll let you in. He's waiting for orders. You'll need him if you want to get close to Viper." Forge looked at Diesel, then back at the man. "I don't need any more lies. I'm not playing games here. The man's eyes widened. I'm telling you the truth. You want Viper, you'll need him. His name's Jake. He's the one who coordinates everything. He's the key to getting to Viper. Diesel dropped the man unceremoniously to the ground, watching him slump to his knees. You're lucky we don't leave you here, Diesel said, his voice low and menacing. Now get out of our way. The man scrambled to his feet and backed away quickly, disappearing into the darkness of the night. Forge didn't wait. He turned to Diesel and the rest of the crew. Let's move, he said. We know where Viper is, and we're not wasting any more time. The group of bikers mounted their bikes and revved their engines, the sound of the motors echoing through the empty streets. The adrenaline was pumping again, but this time, it wasn't just about the child. It was about bringing down the serpents once and for all. They rode through the night, their bikes cutting through the dark streets like a pack of wolves on the hunt. The closer they got to the warehouse, the more the tension built in Forge's chest. He could feel the weight of every promise they had made, the lives they had sworn to protect. This wasn't just a battle for control, it was a battle for justice. They reached the outskirts of the town, and Forge knew they were close. The warehouse loomed ahead, its silhouette casting a dark shadow against the dim lights of the street. This is it, Forge said, his voice steady. We move fast, stay quiet, and get to Jake. If he's who we think he is, he'll know how to get us inside. The bikers nodded, their faces hard with resolve. They had all been through battles before, but this was different. This wasn't just a job. This was personal. They rode toward the back of the warehouse, careful to avoid detection. Forge's heart was pounding as they neared the entrance. Everything depended on this moment. If they got in, they could stop the serpents. If they didn't, there was no telling what would happen next. The back door of the warehouse was just ahead, and Forge's eyes scanned the area, looking for any signs of movement. There was no turning back now. They had come this far, and they weren't about to stop. They dismounted their bikes in silence, every biker moving with precision, their every step calculated. Forge glanced at Diesel, then to the others. This was it. No more games. They were ready to end this, one way or another. Forge pushed open the back door slowly, his heart racing as he slipped inside. The air was thick with the smell of oil and machinery, but it was the sound of voices echoing in the distance that caught his attention. They were close. Viper was close. He motioned for the crew to follow him, their boots silent against the cold concrete floor. Every step brought them closer to the heart of the serpent's operation. And when they found Jake, they would have everything they needed to bring Viper down. The warehouse was a maze, but Forge wasn't worried. He had the experience. They would find their way. They had to. The air inside the warehouse was thick with tension. Forge led the way, his steps deliberate and measured, his eyes scanning every shadow, every corner. The sound of their boots echoed in the cavernous space as they moved through the dimly lit maze of storage containers and old crates. The farther they went, the more the stench of oil, dust, and decay filled their nostrils. But the real danger wasn't in the air. It was the men waiting for them. Forge could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't just about taking down the serpents anymore. This was about making sure nothing like this ever happened again. They had come too far to turn back now. Diesel, Wrench, Phantom, and the rest of the crew stayed close behind, their eyes alert and their hands never far from their weapons. Forge could hear the whispers of the men in the distance, voices muffled by the walls between them, but the distinct sound of their laughter cut through the air like a knife. They think they can just walk in, here like they own the place, one voice sneered. Yeah, another voice agreed. Well, they're about to learn that the serpents aren't afraid of anyone. Forge's pulse quickened as he motioned for his crew to spread out. They had to move fast. The element of surprise was their biggest advantage. They couldn't afford to be spotted before they had a chance to get to Jake, the man who could give them the key to ending this once and for all. Stick to the plan, Forge murmured to Diesel, who nodded without a word, his massive form vanishing into the shadows. The crew moved with precision, disappearing into the dark corners of the warehouse. Forge kept his focus, his hand steady on the grip of his gun. He wasn't afraid. He couldn't afford to be. They had trained for this. They had fought for this. And they weren't going to let the serpents take away the lives they had sworn to protect. As they crept deeper into the building, the voices grew louder, and Forge realized they were closing in on their target. The serpents were gathered near the far end of the warehouse, just beyond the last row of crates. Forge motioned to his crew, and they took their positions, ready for what was about to come. He moved like a shadow, his boots silent against the concrete floor, his breath steady in his chest. He could almost feel the heat of the moment, the anticipation of the fight ahead. This was their moment. They had to get to Jake. They had to stop Viper. And they had to do it now. They reached the end of the row and pressed against the cold metal, listening for any sound, any sign of their target. Then, just as Forge was about to make his move, a door opened ahead. The flicker of light from the hallway caught his attention, and he froze, signaling for the others to stay back. A figure stepped into the doorway, silhouetted against the dim light. It was Jake, the man Forge had been searching for. He didn't hesitate. "Jake," Forge called out, his voice low and commanding. The man froze, his eyes widening in recognition. For a moment, he said nothing, but Forge could see the tension in his face. He knew what was coming. He had to. "I didn't want this," Jake said, his voice shaking. "I didn't want to be part of this." Forge stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "Then you should have walked away when you had the chance." Jake's shoulders slumped, and he stepped further into the light. His eyes were filled with fear, but Forge could see something else, regret. The man was in over his head. "You're right," Jake said quietly. "I should have, but I didn't." And now, his voice trailed off. Forge could see the conflict in his eyes. He wasn't a heartless man, but the life he had chosen had led him down a dark path. "Now you're going to help us take down Viper," Forge said firmly. "And if you don't, we'll do it without you." Jake swallowed hard, his eyes darting between Forge and the other bikers. He had no choice. "Viper's in the back," he said quietly. "He's got a whole crew back there, heavily armed. I don't know how you're going to get through them, but if you're serious about this, you have to get to him before it's too late." Forge didn't flinch. He had been through worse. "We'll make it through," he said, his voice resolute. "You lead the way." Jake nodded slowly, his face resigned. He turned and started walking, Forge and the rest of the crew following close behind. They moved quickly, but cautiously, aware of every sound, every shift in the air. They passed through another door, and suddenly, the back of the warehouse was in sight. It was heavily guarded, but Forge wasn't worried. Not anymore. They had come too far to be stopped now. As they reached the final door, Jake turned to them. "Viper's right behind this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's ready for you." Forge's grip tightened on his gun. "Let's finish this." With a single nod, they kicked the door open, ready for whatever awaited them on the other side. The door slammed open, and the first thing Forge saw was the flickering light of old industrial lamps overhead. The warehouse was eerily quiet for a place that was supposed to house illegal shipments. Forge's eyes scanned the room, searching for any signs of the serpents. He wasn't disappointed. In the far corner, behind a massive stack of crates, stood Viper, his trademark black leather vest gleaming under the dim light, a smirk playing on his lips. He was flanked by two of his men, both armed and ready. The moment Forge stepped into the room, Viper's smirk faded, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. "I knew you'd show up eventually," Viper said, his voice dripping with contempt. "But it's too late, Forge. You're already too late." Forge didn't flinch. His hand tightened on his gun, but he kept his posture relaxed. He had to remain in control. "I'm not here for you, Viper," Forge said, his voice low but filled with authority. "I'm here to end this. You've made a mistake targeting that kid, and you're not walking away from this." Viper laughed, a harsh, cruel sound that echoed through the warehouse. "You think you can stop me? I control this town now, and nobody, least of all you, can take that away from me." The two men flanking Viper stepped forward, their eyes locked on Forge and the crew behind him. They were ready to fight, but Forge wasn't about to give them the chance. "You're wrong," Forge said, his voice unwavering. "It's not your town. It never was." With a swift motion, Forge drew his gun, pointing it directly at Viper. But before he could fire, one of Viper's men lunged at him, a gunshot ringing out in the silence. Forge ducked just in time, the bullet missing him by inches. Diesel was already in motion, charging forward with a roar that shook the room. He tackled the first man to the ground, knocking the gun from his hand before delivering a punch that sent him reeling. "Stay down," Diesel growled, his hands tight around the man's throat, ready to finish it if needed. Meanwhile, the second man, more cautious, pulled out a knife, rushing at Forge. Forge sidestepped the attack, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting it with enough force to make him drop the blade. In one fluid motion, Forge kicked the man's legs out from under him, sending him crashing to the ground. The room exploded into chaos, but Forge never lost sight of Viper. The man had to be stopped. Viper raised his hands, signaling for his men to fall back. "Enough," he yelled, his voice cutting through the noise. The warehouse went silent again. "You've made your point, Forge, but you still don't understand. You think you're saving this kid. You think you're the hero here, but you're too late. This is bigger than you." Forge's eyes narrowed as he took a step closer to Viper. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. Viper's lips curled into a twisted grin. "This was never about the kid. This was about power. You've been a thorn in our side for too long. But now you've sealed your fate." Just then, the sound of sirens echoed in the distance, growing louder by the second. Forge's heart raced. The cops were closing in, and they weren't far off. "You think the cops can save you?" Viper sneered. "You're about to find out just how much control we really have." But before Forge could react, the doors at the far end of the warehouse burst open, and a group of officers stormed in, led by a familiar face, Deputy Harris. Forge didn't hesitate. He stepped toward the officers, shouting, "Get the kid out of here now." Harris nodded and motioned for his team to move in. The officers rushed to the back of the warehouse where the boy had been hidden, securing him as they moved him toward the exit. Viper's face twisted in rage as he realized what was happening. "No, you can't," Viper started, but his words were cut off by Diesel, who punched him square in the jaw, sending him stumbling backward. "We're done here, Viper," Forge said, his voice cold and final. "It's over." The sirens grew louder as the officers began to secure the rest of the warehouse. The rest of Viper's men were either subdued or trying to flee, but there was no escape. The battle had been fought, and the serpents had lost. As the officers led Viper away in handcuffs, Forge turned to Diesel and the rest of the crew. "We did it," Forge said, his voice hoarse but filled with relief. Diesel nodded, wiping the blood from his knuckles. "Yeah, we did. But there's more to clean up." Forge didn't need to ask what Diesel meant. The serpents might be down, but there would always be more trouble ahead. But for now, they had won. And for the first time in a long time, Forge felt like they had truly made a difference. As they watched the last of the serpents being taken away by the police, Forge's eyes turned to the boy, now safe in the arms of his sister. "You're safe now," Forge whispered, though he wasn't sure if the boy could hear him. The job wasn't over, but this chapter was. The fight was won, and the Thunderwolves had proven once again that no one messed with their family. As the last of the serpents were taken away in handcuffs, the sound of the sirens began to fade, replaced by the steady hum of the Thunderwolves' bikes idling in the distance. The warehouse, once a hub of illegal activity, was now a scene of quiet victory. Forge stood still for a moment, his gaze lingering on the officers as they finished securing the building. The tension that had gripped him for so long was slowly beginning to dissolve, but the weight of everything they had been through still hung heavy in the air. Diesel, standing beside him, let out a low breath. "We did it," Diesel said, but there was a hint of exhaustion in his voice. "Yeah, we did," Forge replied, though his voice was distant. He had won, but there was still a lingering sense of unease in his chest. The serpents were taken down, but there would always be more. The world didn't stop spinning just because they'd done something good. They'd made a difference tonight, but that didn't mean the fight was over. As Forge turned to look at the crew, he saw the relief on their faces. Phantom, Wrench, and the others were already talking amongst themselves, the weight of the night's battle finally starting to lift. The little boy, still holding his sister's hand, was now being looked after by the paramedics who had arrived with the police. The girl, who had led them to the warehouse, was standing off to the side, watching the officers work. Forge's heart softened as he saw her. She had been through so much, yet she had never once hesitated to speak up when it mattered most. She had helped them find her brother, and now she was safe. That was all that mattered. Forge walked over to the girl, crouching down to her level. "You're safe now," he said gently, offering her a reassuring smile. The girl looked up at him, her eyes still full of uncertainty, but now carrying a glimmer of hope. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Forge nodded. "No need to thank me. You did all the hard work. The girl's eyes filled with tears once again, but this time, they were tears of relief. She had carried so much fear for so long, and now, it was over. Her brother was safe. They were safe. For the first time in what felt like forever, she smiled. "What's your name?" Forge asked, his voice soft. The girl wiped her eyes, sniffing as she tried to compose herself. "Aisha," she said, her voice steadying. "Aisha. That's a beautiful name," Forge replied. "You did good tonight." Aisha looked down at her shoes, clearly overwhelmed by the weight of the moment. Forge stood up, looking over at the rest of the crew. "We're done here," he said to them. "Let's get out of here before the press shows up. The last thing we need is them poking around asking questions." Diesel cracked a smile. "You got that right." The crew began to pack up, getting ready to leave the scene, their bikes humming to life once more. But Forge's mind was still racing. He had kept his promise to Aisha. He had kept his promise to the boy. They had taken down the serpents. But at what cost? As Forge climbed onto his bike, the weight of the night settled in his chest. They had done the right thing. But the world wasn't done with them yet. It never was. The moment they left this town, there would always be another fight. Another battle. Another enemy lurking in the shadows. But for now, they could rest. For now, they had won. Forge revved the engine of his bike, the sound filling the quiet night. The rest of the crew followed suit, the roar of their engines filling the air as they rode off into the night. The road ahead was long, but they had each other, and that was enough. As they disappeared into the distance, the lights of the police cars flickered behind them, a reminder that the job was never truly finished. But Forge didn't mind. They were a family, and they would keep fighting for as long as it took. No one was safe as long as there were people who needed saving. And they would always be there, on the road, ready for whatever came next. The roar of the Thunder Wolves' engines faded into the distance as they rode away from the warehouse, leaving behind the chaos of the Serpent's operation. The night had been long, the air thick with tension, but now there was a strange calm settling over the group. Forge kept his eyes on the road ahead, but his mind was still racing. The victory over Viper was hard-won, and the satisfaction of knowing the boy and his sister were safe gave him a brief moment of relief. But something gnawed at him. This wasn't over. It never was. The road stretched out before them, dark and endless, but Forge knew that tomorrow would bring another challenge. Another battle. And as much as he wanted to think that this chapter was closed, he couldn't shake the feeling that there were still bigger forces at play. Diesel, riding beside him, glanced over with a look of concern. "You good?" Diesel asked. Forge didn't answer right away, his mind still back in that warehouse, in the face of Viper, the man who had almost torn the club apart. But Forge had no time to dwell on it now. "Yeah," Forge said, his voice steady, though there was a weight in his words. "I'm good." The crew followed in their wake, the hum of their bikes blending together in the quiet night. The small town they passed through was now behind them, and they were on the outskirts of the city. Forge had made the decision to head back to the compound. The crew needed to rest, to regroup, and to process everything that had happened. But as they turned down the familiar road that led to the compound, Forge couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. He had been through enough fights to know when to expect the next one. This fight wasn't just about taking down a few bad guys. It was about something bigger, something deeper. And it wasn't just the serpents that worried him. The world around them was changing, and the peace they fought for was always in danger of slipping through their fingers. The compound came into view, its lights shining through the darkness like a beacon. It was home, but even here, Forge knew the fight would never stop. As the crew parked their bikes and dismounted, Forge glanced over at the others. They were tired, but there was a sense of pride in their eyes. They had done what they set out to do. They had taken down a threat. But that didn't mean they could rest on their laurels. "We've got a lot to sort through," Forge said, his voice carrying the weight of everything that was still unresolved. "But we'll deal with it tomorrow. Right now, we all need some rest." The crew nodded, grateful for the brief reprieve. But Forge couldn't help but think of the bigger picture. Viper was gone, but the serpents were still out there. And if they were still around, there would be others. This wasn't over. Forge walked into the compound, the sound of the door shutting behind him signaling the end of their long night. He made his way to the back office, where his old friend and club attorney, Derek Bonds, was waiting. "You've been quiet tonight," Bonds said, looking up from his desk. "You okay?" Forge dropped into the chair across from him, rubbing his face with his hands. "I'm fine," Forge said, though the exhaustion was starting to show. "We got the kid, and we stopped Viper, but this whole thing stinks. Something bigger's going on, and I don't know if we're ready for it." Bonds leaned back in his chair, his face serious. "You think the serpents were just a small part of this?" "I don't know," Forge replied. "But I'm starting to think this is bigger than just a gang war. Viper was after more than money. There's a lot more at play here, and I don't know if we're prepared for what's coming next." Bonds nodded, his eyes narrowing. "We've been through a lot, Forge. But we've got each other. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." Forge gave him a grim smile. "Yeah, we will. But I just can't shake the feeling that we're on the verge of something much worse." There was a long silence between them as Forge stared out the window. The night was quiet, but in the back of his mind, Forge could feel the storm brewing. It wasn't just about the serpents anymore. The world around them was changing, and Forge knew that the fight they had won tonight would only be the beginning. The next battle was coming, and it would be bigger than anything they had faced before. As he stood up to leave the office, Forge's mind raced with the possibilities of what lay ahead. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. The Thunderwolves were ready. They would fight for what was right, no matter the cost. And they would stand together, no matter what came their way. The morning sun had barely risen, casting a golden glow over the compound, but Forge had been awake for hours. The weight of last night's battle, though victorious, still clung to him like a heavy fog. He sat in the back office, looking over the notes from the police, the evidence from the warehouse raid, trying to make sense of it all. The serpents were gone, but Forge knew better than to think that meant peace. No, this was only the beginning. He had been through enough to understand the cycles of violence. When one leader fell, another would rise to take their place. And Viper had been just one piece of the puzzle. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Diesel, his massive frame filling the doorway. "You up for a ride today?" Diesel asked, his voice gruff, but with a hint of concern. Forge looked up, meeting Diesel's gaze. "Yeah, I think we need to talk to someone." Diesel nodded, his expression hardening as he understood the implication. "I'm with you." Forge grabbed his leather jacket and headed for the door. The air outside was crisp, the sky clear as they mounted their bikes. The hum of the engines was a familiar comfort, and as the rest of the crew gathered around, Forge felt a sense of purpose settle in. They were a family, and no matter what was coming, they would face it together. As they rode through the quiet streets, Forge's mind wandered back to the clues from last night. Jake had mentioned someone higher up, someone pulling the strings from behind the scenes. They had to find out who this person was before the serpents regrouped. The ride took them through the outskirts of town, the streets becoming emptier as they approached the old part of the city. They stopped in front of a rundown building that hadn't seen a tenant in years. Forge dismounted and looked at Diesel. "This is where we get answers." Diesel's eyes scanned the building. "You sure about this?" "I'm sure," Forge said, his jaw set. "If we're going to end this, we need to find out who's really behind the serpents. This place used to be a front for a lot of illegal activity. If anyone knows something, it's here." The crew moved quickly, slipping through a side entrance into the dark building. The air smelled of mold and dust, and the silence was suffocating. They moved cautiously, aware that whoever had used this place as a base might still be lurking around. Forge led the way, his boots echoing in the emptiness. As they moved deeper into the building, they reached a small office at the back. The door was cracked open, and Forge pushed it gently, his eyes scanning the room. There, sitting behind a desk covered in paperwork, was a man Forge had hoped never to see again. A familiar figure who had once been a part of the Thunderwolves, a man named Sam. Sam looked up slowly, his face pale and worn, but there was no mistaking the coldness in his eyes. He hadn't aged well. Forge felt a pang of betrayal, but he pushed it down. This was about more than personal feelings now. "I figured you'd come for me eventually," Sam said, his voice weak but defiant. "You always were too good at sniffing out trouble, Forge." "What the hell are you doing here, Sam?" Forge asked, his voice low, dangerous. "This was supposed to be over. You were supposed to leave that life behind." Sam's lips curled into a twisted smile. "You think I left it? You think you could just walk away from the life we built? You were always the one with the dream of getting out. Me? I knew what this was. And now look where we are." Diesel stepped forward, his large frame looming over Sam. "You're working with Viper? After everything we did?" Sam's eyes flickered to Diesel, but he didn't flinch. You think Viper's the real problem here? He scoffed. Viper's just a pawn in a much bigger game. The serpents aren't the threat. They're just the distraction. You want the real enemy? You need to look beyond the gang. Forge's stomach tightened. What the hell are you talking about? Sam stood slowly, walking over to a filing cabinet. He opened it, pulling out a thick folder. This is what's been driving all the violence. There's someone else pulling the strings. Someone far more dangerous than Viper. And if you don't stop them, everything we've done, all the blood we've shed, will have been for nothing. Sam tossed the folder on the desk, sliding it over to Forge. Forge opened it without hesitation, his eyes scanning the contents. Names, dates, locations, everything pointed to a larger organization. One that had been operating in the shadows for years, manipulating the serpents and using them to cover their tracks. Forge's heart pounded in his chest as he read. This was bigger than he had ever imagined. Who are they? Forge asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The Order, Sam replied. They control everything. The serpents were just one piece of the puzzle. The real power is behind the scenes, pulling strings, controlling everything you thought you knew. And now they're coming for you, Forge. The words hit Forge like a punch to the gut. The Order. He had heard rumors, whispers of a group that worked from the shadows, controlling the criminal underworld. But he had never believed them. Until now. Forge's mind raced as the pieces started to come together. This wasn't just about gangs anymore. This was about something much darker, something far more dangerous. And the Thunderwolves were about to find themselves in the fight of their lives. We'll stop them, Forge said, his voice filled with resolve. We won't let them win. Diesel's voice was low and dangerous. No more running. We're finishing this. The crew nodded, ready for whatever came next. The battle had only just begun. Forge stood motionless, the weight of Sam's words hanging in the air. The Order. He had heard the rumors, but now they were real. The reality of it hit him like a cold, hard slap to the face. He could feel the anger bubbling inside him, but he had to stay focused. The Thunderwolves were more than just a gang. They were a family, and this was their fight. The files in front of him showed names, dates, and locations, all pointing to something far larger than anything he had imagined. The serpents had been a distraction. The Order was the true enemy. We need to find them, Forge said, his voice grim but determined. He looked at Diesel, who was standing at the door, arms crossed, a grim expression on his face. We'll get them, Diesel replied, his voice as steady as ever. Forge nodded, the fire in his chest burning brighter. They had stopped Viper, but now they had to deal with the real threat. Sam had given them the map. It was up to them to follow it. Forge stood up, looking around the room at the rest of the crew. Wrench, Phantom, and the others were gathered around the table, staring at the evidence in front of them. The air was thick with anticipation. This was it. They couldn't afford to wait. We need to move fast, Forge said. The Order won't stop. They'll come for us, and they'll come hard. We need to hit them before they have a chance to regroup. Wrench looked up from the papers, his brow furrowed. What's the plan? We go after their operations, Forge said, his voice low but filled with purpose. We find where they're hiding, and we make them pay. We take out their leaders one by one, until there's no one left to run things. Diesel grunted. Sounds like a plan to me, but we need to know who they are first. Forge turned back to Sam, who was still sitting at the desk, looking defeated. You've been working with them for a long time, Sam. You must know who's at the top. Tell me everything you know. Sam hesitated, but then spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know much. The Order's too secretive. But I do know this. There's a man named Reynolds. He's the one pulling the strings. He's the leader of the Order, and he's ruthless. If you want to take them down, you have to take him out first. Forge's eyes narrowed. Reynolds. We'll find him. He's not easy to find, Sam warned. He's got people everywhere. Cops, politicians, business owners. He's got his fingers in every pie. If you go after him, it won't be like dealing with Viper. This man has resources. He's dangerous. We've dealt with dangerous before, Diesel said, his voice firm. And we'll deal with him too. Forge nodded, his jaw clenched. We won't let them get away with this. We'll do whatever it takes. Sam looked at him, a faint glimmer of hope in his eyes. You're really going to stop them, aren't you? Forge didn't respond at first. He just stared at the man who had once been part of their crew, a man who had turned his back on everything they had fought for. We'll stop them, Forge finally said. But you're coming with us. Sam's eyes widened. What? No, you owe us that. Much, Forge interrupted. You're not walking away from this. If you want redemption, you'll help us take down Reynolds. Sam looked defeated, but Forge could see a flicker of something in his eyes. He didn't say anything, but Forge knew he was going to help. He had no choice. Let's move out, Forge said, turning to the rest of the crew. We'll find Reynolds and end this once and for all. The crew nodded, their faces hard with determination. The engines roared to life as the Thunder Wolves mounted their bikes. The road ahead was long, but this time, they had a plan. Forge felt the weight of the moment settle into his bones. This wasn't just about taking down a gang. This was about stopping a force that had infiltrated every corner of their world. And the Thunder Wolves were the only ones who could take them down. As they rode into the night, the only sound was the hum of their engines, the promise of what was to come hanging heavy in the air. They were ready. They had to be. This fight wasn't just for them. It was for everyone who had ever been hurt by the Order's reach. They would take them down, piece by piece, until there was nothing left. Forge had made a promise, and he was going to keep it. The Thunder Wolves were going to take back control, and they were going to do it together. The night had fallen silent once again, but this time, it felt different. Forge's mind was still racing as they rolled down the long stretch of road, heading towards the warehouse where Reynolds, if Sam's information was right, was waiting. The hum of the engines was a steady pulse beneath him, but his thoughts were scattered. The gravity of the situation was beginning to hit him harder than ever. Reynolds wasn't just another thug like Viper. He wasn't even the type to fight face to face. He was a mastermind, a shadow in the criminal underworld who had orchestrated everything from behind closed doors. And Forge wasn't sure what the next move would be, but he knew one thing for sure. It was going to be a battle unlike any they had faced before. As they approached the outskirts of the city, Forge signaled for the crew to slow down. The warehouse came into view, its silhouette towering against the faint light of the moon. It was old, run down, just like most of the places the Thunder Wolves had raided in the past. But this one felt different. This wasn't just some low-level operation. This was where the heart of the Order was beating. Forge parked his bike behind an old, abandoned building, where they could keep out of sight. Diesel dismounted beside him, his face unreadable, but the tension in his shoulders told Forge everything he needed to know. What now? Diesel asked, his voice low but firm. Forge took a deep breath, scanning the warehouse. We find Reynolds. We don't make a move until we have him. We stick to the plan. No mercy. The rest of the crew gathered around, ready for the next step. Wrench, Phantom, and the others all stood at attention, their faces grim. No one spoke, but the weight of the mission hung over them. They weren't just fighting for revenge anymore. They were fighting for something much bigger. They were fighting to take down the people who had manipulated so many lives, including their own. Forge motioned for them to move, and they crept through the shadows, approaching the back of the warehouse. The quiet was suffocating, but Forge didn't let it shake him. He had led his crew through worse. He had seen the darkness, and he wasn't afraid of it. But as they neared the back door, he felt a chill crawl down his spine. Something didn't feel right. Stay alert, Forge whispered to the crew. Something's off. This is too quiet. They reached the door, and Forge motioned for Diesel to check it. Diesel nodded and pushed the door slowly, revealing a dimly lit interior. It was empty. Too empty. The silence only heightened the suspicion growing in Forge's chest. Keep moving, he muttered. The crew filed in, staying close to the walls, weapons at the ready. They moved deeper into the warehouse, the shadows stretching out around them. They passed rows of stacked crates, some of them broken open, revealing nothing but dust and debris. It looked like the place had been abandoned. But Forge knew better. He could feel it in his gut. Reynolds was close. They reached the center of the warehouse, and that's when they heard it. The sound of voices, muffled at first, but growing louder with each passing second. Forge signaled for them to stop. This is it, he said quietly. We're close. They continued, moving stealthily toward the source of the noise. And then they saw him. Reynolds was standing in the middle of the room, flanked by two of his men, watching them with cold, calculating eyes. He wasn't fazed by their presence. He knew they were coming. Forge's heart pounded in his chest as Reynolds stepped forward, a slight smirk curling on his lips. I was wondering when you'd show up, Forge, he said, his voice smooth and confident. You've made quite a name for yourself. Forge didn't say anything at first. He couldn't let Reynolds see his hesitation. This was the moment. This was where everything would change. You've been running things from the shadows for too long, Forge finally said, his voice steady, but with an edge. It's time for you to face the consequences. Reynolds chuckled, his eyes glinting with amusement. Consequences? He repeated. I think you've misunderstood, Forge. I'm not the one who's going to face consequences. You are. Forge's brow furrowed, and in that instant he knew. This wasn't just about taking down Reynolds. It was about something much bigger. Reynolds wasn't afraid. In fact, he looked almost bored, as if he had anticipated everything. The realization hit Forge like a punch to the gut. This wasn't going to be easy. And just as he prepared to make his next move, he heard the unmistakable sound of more engines approaching from outside. The Serpents weren't just a gang. They were a network, and Reynolds had allies everywhere. Forge cursed under his breath as Diesel stepped forward, ready for action. We've got company, Diesel muttered, his hand on his gun. Forge clenched his fists. They had come this far, and they weren't backing down now. We're taking him down, Forge said, his voice low but filled with resolve. Get ready. As the sound of motorcycles grew louder outside, the Thunderwolves prepared for the fight of their lives. This wasn't just about a gang war anymore. It was about stopping a network of corruption that had taken hold of everything they had fought for. And Forge knew one thing for sure. They weren't going to let it stand. The tension in the warehouse was unbearable as the sound of approaching motorcycles grew louder. Forge stood frozen, his hand gripping his gun tighter. The Serpents were closing in, and they were ready to finish what Viper had started. But Forge wasn't about to let them. Not this time. They're coming, Diesel muttered, his voice low but urgent. We need to make this count. Forge nodded, eyes never leaving Reynolds, who was still standing in the center of the room, smug and calm. But Forge could feel the change in the air. This wasn't just a face-off anymore. They were fighting for more than survival. They were fighting for everything they had ever believed in. The Thunderwolves weren't just a gang, they were a family. And they would protect each other until the very end. We move when I say, Forge ordered, his voice firm and steady. Diesel and the others shifted, ready for whatever came next. As the bikes roared to a stop outside, Forge took a deep breath. It was time. Now, he said, and without another word, he and Diesel stormed forward. The first shots rang out, deafening in the silent warehouse. Forge's heart pounded, but his movements were fluid, precise. He dropped to a knee, aiming at one of Viper's men, and fired. The man went down, but Forge didn't hesitate. He stood, scanning the room for Reynolds, who had disappeared into the chaos. The sound of gunfire echoed as Diesel took down another Serpent. The rest of the crew was right behind them, engaging with the Serpents in a battle they had been preparing for their entire lives. But Forge couldn't focus on the fight around him. He had one mission: get to Reynolds. As he moved through the warehouse, he saw Viper's men retreating into the shadows, but Reynolds was nowhere in sight. Forge cursed under his breath and made his way toward the back office. He knew Reynolds would be hiding there, a coward. The moment Forge stepped inside, he saw Reynolds, standing near a large desk, a smug smile on his face. You've come for me, Forge, Reynolds said, his voice calm, even amused. But it's too late. You've already lost. Forge's eyes narrowed. You're the one who's lost. Without hesitation, he lunged forward, tackling Reynolds to the ground. They struggled for a moment, Reynolds' cold eyes locked onto his. But Forge was faster, stronger. He pinned Reynolds to the floor, holding him down with one hand. You've been pulling the strings from behind the scenes for too long, Forge growled. But this is where it ends. Reynolds let out a laugh, a cruel sound that grated on Forge's nerves. You think this will stop anything? You think you've won? The Order has already set its plans in motion. You're just a small obstacle in a much larger game. Forge's grip tightened. Not anymore. Just then, Diesel barged into the room, his fists clenched, ready to deal with Reynolds if needed. But Forge held up a hand, signaling him to stay back. This ends now, Forge said, his voice colder than ice. He turned to Reynolds, his eyes burning with determination. You're done. Your game is over. Reynolds' smirk faded, but he still refused to beg for mercy. You think you've beaten me? He spat. You've barely scratched the surface. But Forge wasn't listening anymore. He had heard enough. With a final movement, Forge restrained Reynolds, ensuring he couldn't escape. The battle outside had begun to quiet, and Forge knew it was only a matter of time before the police arrived. He didn't want to leave Reynolds to the authorities just yet. Not until he had answers. The crew filed into the room, and Diesel stepped forward. "What now?" he asked, his voice steady but tinged with exhaustion. Forge turned to him, eyes cold and resolute. "Now we finish what we started. We make sure Reynolds and the Order never have the power to hurt anyone again." Reynolds was still defiant, but Forge could see the cracks beginning to show. He was running out of places to hide. The weight of the situation was settling in, and Forge knew that the end was near. But this victory wasn't just about taking down Reynolds. It was about proving that no one could control them, no one could take what they held dear. This was their family, and they weren't about to let anyone destroy it. The police arrived soon after, taking Reynolds and his remaining men into custody. Forge watched them being led out of the warehouse, but his mind was already on the next step. The fight wasn't over. There would always be more. But tonight, they had won. And for now, that was enough. As the Thunderwolves gathered outside the warehouse, the sound of their bikes revving to life filled the air once more. They had done what they set out to do. They had stopped the serpents. They had stopped the Order. And they had protected their own. They were a family. And as long as they had each other, there was nothing they couldn't face. With that, Forge gave one last look at the now quiet warehouse and mounted his bike. The road ahead was long, but they were ready for whatever came next. And this time, they were in control.